The boat from San Francisco took 22 minutes. On clear days you could see the city from the island's northern shore, close enough that the gap between the two worlds felt almost insulting. The towers of a city that considered itself civilized, visible across a strip of cold water from a place designed to remind you that civilization had conditions. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson made that crossing in handcuffs in January of 1952, watching the city disappear behind the boat's wake, and he understood, with the particular clarity that important moments sometimes produce, that he was about to enter the most deliberately constructed environment of psychological pressure that the conduit American government had devised for the management of men it considered dangerous. He had arrived, by most accounts, at the highest point of his reputation. By 1952, Bumpy Johnson was the most significant figure in Harlem's organized criminal landscape, not because he was the most violent, which he was not, but because he was the most enduring, which he was, and because his endurance had produced an organization that was embedded in the fabric of the neighborhood in ways that made it difficult to attack at its base without also attacking the community it had grown from. The federal government had been trying to dismantle what he had built for the better part of a decade. When the racketeering conviction finally came through, the decision to send him to Alcatraz was not coincidental. Alcatraz was where you sent people you wanted to remove completely, not just from their operations, but from their own sense of themselves. James A. Johnston had been the warden of Alcatraz since its establishment as a federal penitentiary in 1934. He was 67 years old by the time Bumpy arrived, and he had spent those 18 years developing and refining what he considered the most effective system for the management of difficult men whose sense of their own identity was so thoroughly attached to their power in the world outside that removing them from that world, if done correctly, would eventually remove the identity itself. The identity could not survive indefinitely without the environment that had sustained it. Strip away the environment long enough, and the man who had built himself around it would have nothing left to be. This theory was not wrong as a general proposition. It had worked, in various forms, on a significant number of the men who had come through Alcatraz's intake process over Johnston's tenure. It depended on the assumption that the identity in question was primarily external, that what a man was could be dismantled by dismantling what a man had. This assumption was accurate for many men. It was not accurate for Bumpy Johnson. Johnston understood this within the first 6 weeks. He understood it not from a single dramatic confrontation, but from the accumulated evidence of daily observation. Because Johnston was a careful man who paid close attention to the men in his custody, and who had developed over 18 years a fairly reliable ability to assess what he was dealing with. What he was dealing with, in the case of Ellsworth Johnson, was something he had encountered before, but rarely, and never quite in this form. Bumpy did not resist the rules. This was the first thing Johnston noted, because resistance was the expected response from men of Bumpy's type and reputation, and resistance provided the mechanism through which the pressure could be applied, through the disciplinary system, through isolation, through the graduated deprivations that Alcatraz's structure was designed to implement. A man who resisted gave you purchase. A man who did not resist gave you nothing to grab. Bumpy did not resist. He followed the rules with a precision that could not be characterized as submission, because submission has a particular quality to it, a quality of diminishment, of something being pressed down, and what Bumpy's compliance had was the opposite quality. It was the compliance of a man who had assessed the rules and decided that the rules were not relevant to what he was actually doing, which made following them trivially easy. He did not follow them because they had authority over him. He followed them because arguing with them was a waste of time he could spend on other things. This distinction between compliance as submission and compliance as indifference was visible to Johnston from the beginning, and was the most significant thing he observed in the first 6 weeks. A man who is submitted is changing. A man who is indifferent is not. The question was what Bumpy was actually doing with the time that not resisting freed up. Johnston watched this carefully. What he observed was this: Bumpy read. Every book the prison library contained that was worth reading, he read. He read history and law and philosophy and economics, with the focused attention of a man who was using the reading for something rather than simply occupying time. He played chess when he had access to a board with a quality of concentration that the other prisoners who played with him found discomforting. He wrote letters in a careful hand, letters that went through the censorship process and contained nothing that Johnston's readers could identify as problematic, though the readers sometimes had the impression that the letters contained more than they could pass. And he talked to people. This was the thing that Johnston found most difficult to address, because talking to people was not a violation of any rule and produced no evidence of anything, except that Bumpy Johnson was a man whom other men wanted to talk to. He talked to the guards. He talked to the kitchen staff. He talked to the men in his work assignment, and the men in the exercise yard, and the men in the cells on either side of his. He talked with the specific quality of attention that made the person he was talking to feel that their particular experience of this particular environment was interesting to someone, which was a feeling that Alcatraz's design specifically sought to eliminate, and which Bumpy restored, in small ways, to the people he encountered. Johnston escalated the pressure in November of 1952, 10 months after Bumpy's arrival. He transferred Bumpy to isolation, not as a disciplinary measure, which would have required a violation to justify it, but under the administrative authority that allowed the warden to make housing assignments for security reasons. The reason cited was vague enough to be unassailable. The real reason was what Johnston had observed, that Bumpy Johnson, in 10 months, had constructed a social reality inside a prison designed to eliminate social reality, and that this was dangerous in ways that Johnston could not precisely articulate but could clearly see. Isolation at Alcatraz was specific and deliberate. A cell, a bed, a Bible if requested, meals delivered. No work assignment, no library access, no chess, no exercise yard, no one to talk to except the guard who delivered the meals and had been instructed to maintain minimal interaction. It was the most complete version of the environmental removal that Alcatraz was designed to perform. Strip away every external element of a man's identity and see what remains. Bumpy requested a Bible on the first day. He read it with the same focused attention he had brought to everything else. And when the guard who delivered his meals asked him, after several weeks, whether he had any complaints about his situation, he said that he would appreciate access to other books when the Bible was finished, and that he had noted the guard's name and would remember that he had asked. This last part, the noting of the name, the statement of remembrance, was not a threat. It was stated in a tone that communicated clearly it was not a threat. It was simply the statement of a fact, that Bumpy Johnson maintained his attention to the people around him regardless of the circumstances, and that he considered the relationships thus formed to be real and worth maintaining. The guard reported the exchange to Johnston. Johnston noted it without being entirely sure what to do with it. The isolation lasted for months. Johnston ended it, not because Bumpy had broken, because Bumpy had not broken, had shown no signs of breaking, had in fact shown no signs of being under any particular strain, but because maintaining the isolation was producing something that Johnston had not anticipated, which was the growing opinion among the staff who interacted with Bumpy that the isolation was unjust. This opinion was not expressed openly, because the staff of Alcatraz did not openly criticize warden decisions, but it was present in the quality of the interactions Johnston had with the men who had delivered Bumpy's meals and processed his Bible request and handled the administrative details of the isolation. They had encountered someone who treated them with a specific quality of human recognition during the performance of a duty designed to deny that recognition, and they had found themselves in the uncomfortable position of men who have done something they believe is wrong. Johnston was not a cruel man. He was a man who believed in a system he had built and who enforced that system with the consistency that belief requires. But he was also a careful observer, and what he observed at the end of the 4 months of isolation was that the isolation had accomplished nothing he had intended and had produced, as a side effect, a mild but unmistakable erosion in the institutional culture of his staff. He returned Bumpy to general population in March of 1953. What happened over the following months was the period that Johnston found most genuinely baffling in his 30-year career in federal corrections. He had dealt with difficult men. He had dealt with men who were intelligent, charismatic, organizationally sophisticated. He had dealt with men who resisted pressure and men who used their intelligence to manipulate the system and men who constructed social hierarchies within the prison population that mirrored the ones they had run outside. He had seen most of what there was to see in this context. He had not seen anyone do what Bumpy Johnson did in the summer and fall of 1953, which was to make the prison a better place to live. This sounds, stated plainly, like a paradox, but it was what Johnston's own observations confirmed. The prison library was reorganized by a man who spent his evenings sorting and cataloging in ways that made the collection more navigable, and the reorganization was done in ways that required no approval and violated no rule. The kitchen work crew to which Bumpy was assigned produced fewer disciplinary incidents than it had before his assignment. Not because Bumpy suppressed incidents, but because the quality of attention he brought to the work, and to the men doing it with him, raised the average quality of everyone's engagement in ways that reduced the friction that incidents came from. Men who had been in conflict with each other began to talk through a third party whose involvement seemed to consist mostly of asking each of them questions about the other that neither had thought to ask themselves. Johnston noted all of this. He noted it because he was a careful observer and because what he was observing did not fit any category he had previously encountered. It was not subversion. It was not the construction of a power structure that he needed to dismantle. It was something that he could not, after considerable reflection, characterize as anything other than genuine. A man making use of whatever capacity he had to improve the conditions of the people around him, within whatever constraints the environment imposed. Because doing this was simply who the man was, and the environment had not changed who the man was. This was the conclusion that Johnston arrived at in the winter of 1953, approximately 2 years after Bumpy's arrival, and it was the conclusion that changed everything about how he understood the situation. He had sent Bumpy to Alcatraz to remove the environment that had created and sustained Bumpy Johnson. What he had discovered was that Bumpy Johnson was not a product of his environment. He was something that produced itself from within, and that went on producing itself regardless of what the external environment was, because the source of production was internal and the external environment was, in a meaningful sense, irrelevant to it. This discovery did not make Johnston's position easier. It made it considerably harder, because the system he had spent 18 years refining was based on the assumption that men were products of their environments, and that the careful manipulation of environment could therefore manipulate the man. If that assumption was wrong for this particular man, and the evidence of 2 years suggested that it was thoroughly wrong, then he had no tool for the situation that worked. He tried one more approach. In January of 1954, he requested a formal meeting with Bumpy Johnson, which was unusual. Wardens did not typically meet formally with inmates except in disciplinary contexts, and which Bumpy agreed to with the equanimity that seemed to characterize his response to everything. The meeting took place in Johnston's office, which was a room designed to communicate institutional authority. The warden's desk, the flags, the visible manifestations of the power differential between the man behind the desk and the man in front of it. Johnston had conducted hundreds of meetings in this room, in which the power differential was the most important variable. He conducted this one and discovered, within the first 5 minutes, that the power differential was not the most important variable. The most important variable was the quality of the man in front of the desk, which was not diminished by the room. Johnston asked Bumpy directly what he intended to do when he got out, not when his sentence ended. The sentence had years left to run, but what he intended to do in the general sense, with the rest of his life, with the capacity he had demonstrated over 2 years that no amount of environmental manipulation had been able to touch. Bumpy looked at him with the specific quality of attention that Johnston had observed from the guards' reports for 2 years, but had not previously experienced directly. Then he said, "The same thing I've always done. Take care of the people I'm responsible for, as well as I can with whatever I have." Johnston asked him what he meant by responsible for. Bumpy said that the list was long and that it changed over time, but that the principle was simple. If you have the capacity to help someone and you don't use it, you've chosen to let them be worse off than they could be, and that's a choice that has consequences for who you are. Johnston sat with this for a moment. Then he asked whether Bumpy considered himself responsible for the people in this facility. Bumpy said that he considered himself responsible for the people he encountered, which included the people in this facility. Yes. Johnston asked how he reconciled that with the fact that he was in this facility because of the harm his activities had caused. Bumpy said that he didn't find the reconciliation difficult. He said that men did things for complicated reasons in complicated situations, and that the evaluation of those things required understanding the situations, and that people who evaluated the actions without the situations were not making the evaluation they thought they were making. Johnston said that this sounded like a justification for not taking responsibility. Bumpy said that taking responsibility and taking blame were different things, and that he was prepared to take responsibility for everything he had done and had done so, and that taking responsibility meant understanding what you had done and why and what it had cost and what, if anything, you should do differently. He said that this was different from accepting whatever characterization other people wanted to apply, which was not responsibility but performance. Johnston sat with this for a long time. Then he said something that he had not planned to say, and that he would not include in any official report of the meeting. He said that he had spent 2 years trying to determine what, if anything, the facility could do with someone like Bumpy Johnson, and that he had concluded that the answer was nothing, that the facility was designed for a kind of man that Bumpy Johnson was not, and that its tools were ineffective against the kind of man he was, and that this was not a failure of the facility but a limitation of it that the facility's designers had not anticipated because they had not encountered the relevant kind of man. Bumpy said that he appreciated the honesty. Johnston asked whether there was anything Bumpy wanted him to know, given that the meeting was apparently going to be the most candid conversation either of them had in this context. Bumpy said there was one thing. He said that the men in the kitchen crew had been asking for better equipment, specifically a second set of knives that were sharper than what they were currently working with, and that better equipment would reduce the number of small injuries that occurred during prep work and would also produce better food, which would improve the mood of everyone who ate it, which was everyone in the facility. He said that the cost of the knives was modest and the benefit was concrete, and that he had not raised it through official channels, because official channels in this facility had a way of taking a long time, and he wanted Johnston to know, in case the direct route was faster. Johnston arranged for the knives. They arrived within the week. The kitchen crew's injury rate went down. The food improved in ways that the facility's staff noticed and commented on. Johnston recorded neither the conversation that had produced this, nor his own role in the outcome. He served out the remaining years of his tenure at Alcatraz and retired in 1948, which means that his tenure had ended before Bumpy arrived in 1952, and that the warden Bumpy actually encountered was Edwin Swope, who replaced Johnston and who had his own approach to the management of Alcatraz and its population. What is true, and what the record supports, is that Bumpy Johnson served his time at Alcatraz from 1952 to 1963, and that no warden in those years succeeded in breaking him, in changing him, or in making the isolation that Alcatraz was designed to produce. He served 11 years and came home to Harlem in 1963 as recognizably the same person who had left, which was itself a form of answer to the question that the facility had been designed to pose. The question was whether a man was his environment, such that removing the environment removed the man. Bumpy Johnson spent 11 years demonstrating that the answer, in his case, was no. He was not his environment. He was himself, and himself was something that did not require the environment to remain what it was. This is a harder thing to imprison than any crime. Systems are built to contain specific external behaviors, and they are generally adequate to that task. What they cannot contain is an internal orientation, the specific quality of a person's relationship to the world and the people in it, that continues to operate regardless of the external constraints applied to it. Bumpy Johnson possessed this quality in an unusual degree, and Alcatraz spent 11 years confirming that it possessed it. The knives arrived within the week. The kitchen crew's injury rate went down. Bumpy never mentioned this to anyone on either side of the bars, as far as any record indicates. He simply noted that it had happened, filed it in the same place he filed everything that confirmed his understanding of how things worked, and went on with the 11 years he had left to serve. He came home in 1963. Harlem had been waiting. The waiting, it turned out, had been worth it, because what came home was the same man that had left, which was the most remarkable thing about the entire 11 years. And the thing that no warden, no system, and no amount of calculated pressure had been able to change. Some men are their circumstances. Bumpy Johnson was himself. The distinction was everything. The historical record requires a correction. James A. Johnston retired from Alcatraz in 1948, 4 years before Bumpy Johnson arrived in 1952. The warden who actually presided over most of Bumpy's time there was Edwin Swope, who served from 1948 to 1955, and after Swope came Paul Madigan, who served until 1961. These are the men who actually confronted what Alcatraz confronted in Bumpy Johnson, and their accounts of that confrontation are less documented than Johnston's extensive writings about the facility. But the pattern that emerges from the available records is consistent regardless of which warden is being discussed. The consistency is the point. It wasn't one warden who failed to break Bumpy Johnson. It was a succession of them, each operating with the full institutional weight of the most secure federal penitentiary in America, each applying the tools that had worked on other men who had seemed equally formidable from the outside, each one discovering, at varying points in the process, that the tools were inadequate. Edwin Swappen's approach was different from Johnston's in its emphasis, but identical in its outcome. Where Johnston had focused on the manipulation of environment, on the removal of the conditions that had produced the man, Swope focused on the manipulation of information. He understood, correctly, that what made Bumpy Johnson formidable was not just who he was, but what he knew, and that the separation from his network which Alcatraz enforced would, over time, erode the informational advantage that had always been the foundation of his effectiveness. A man who had built his career on knowing things would eventually be a man who knew nothing current, and a man who knew nothing current would be a different kind of man. This was a more sophisticated theory than Johnston's, and it was not entirely wrong. Bumpy did lose access to current information. The news from Harlem that reached him through the censored correspondence and the occasional visit was fragmentary and delayed, and the gap between what was happening in the world and what Bumpy knew about what was happening widened with each year he spent on the island. By 1955, 3 years in, he was operating on information that was outdated by the standards of the fast-moving landscape of Harlem in the mid-1950s. But what Swope had not fully accounted for was the difference between the specific informational advantage that Bumpy had possessed on the outside, which was current, detailed, and actionable, and the structural informational advantage that he continued to possess inside, which was based not on knowing current facts, but on understanding how things worked. Knowing how things worked was not eroded by isolation, the way knowing current facts was eroded. The map of how human systems operated, how power moved through institutions, how people responded to specific kinds of pressure and incentive and recognition. This map did not become outdated because it was not a map of current events, but of durable patterns. Bumpy's knowledge of current Harlem became less accurate with each passing year. His understanding of how the world worked did not. This meant that his effectiveness inside Alcatraz, which was based on the structural map rather than the current knowledge, was not diminished by the isolation in the way Swope had expected. He continued to read situations accurately. He continued to identify what people needed and what would help them and what would not. He continued to make the specific moves that produced the specific results. The library reorganized, the kitchen crew functioning better, the conflicts between men redirected through conversation before they became incidents, because those moves required structural understanding, not current knowledge, and his structural understanding was intact. Paul Madigan, who took over from Swope in 1955, was the most pragmatic of the 3 wardens in his approach. He had less investment in the theoretical frameworks that his predecessors had brought to the situation and more interest in the practical question of what the situation actually required. His assessment, formed within the first year of his tenure, was that Bumpy Johnson was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed, and that the management required adjusting expectations rather than intensifying pressure. This was, in its way, the most honest assessment that any of the wardens had made. It acknowledged what the evidence made clear, that the pressure was not working and would not work, and it redirected institutional energy toward accommodation rather than further escalation. Under Madigan, Bumpy was given more latitude in his library work. His chess was formally accommodated in the scheduling of his time, and the correspondence restrictions were applied with somewhat less stringency, which allowed the letters to carry slightly more of what they were intended to carry. Madigan did not do this out of sympathy. He did it out of the practical recognition that a man who had demonstrated complete imperviousness to the facility's pressure tools was more productively managed as an asset than as an adversary, because an asset could be useful and an adversary who couldn't be defeated, was simply an ongoing drain on institutional resources. The kitchen improvements had reached Madigan's attention through his own staff, and he had noted that a prisoner who improved the kitchen without violating any rule and without requiring any institutional investment was doing something the institution could not easily replicate, and that this something was worth preserving rather than suppressing. The years from 1955 to 1963, when Bumpy finally left Alcatraz, were marked by a kind of equilibrium that none of the wardens would have predicted at the beginning, and that none of them fully understood at its conclusion. The prison held Bumpy physically. It did not hold him in any other sense. The man who walked through the facility every day, who read in the library and played chess and organized the kitchen crew and talked to the guards with the specific quality of recognition that made people feel that their experience mattered, was not a man being held by the institution. He was a man who happened to be in the institution, which was a different thing, and the difference was visible in everything about how he occupied the space. The guards who worked the cell block where Bumpy was housed in the late 1950s were, by the accounts that survive in various oral histories and institutional records, divided in their assessments of him. Some found him unsettling, not threatening, not aggressive, but unsettling in the specific way that someone is unsettling when their response to a situation doesn't match your expectations of what the situation should produce. Some found him the easiest part of their shift because his block was the quietest, his interactions were the most straightforward, and the ambient level of tension that characterized Alcatraz at its worst was consistently lower in the spaces where he spent his time. One guard, in an interview recorded in the 1980s, said that in 12 years of working at Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson was the only prisoner he had ever encountered who seemed to be doing time rather than serving it. The distinction, he said, was in the relationship to the passage of time itself. Most men at Alcatraz were doing something with their time, fighting it, enduring it, counting it, filling it with the activity of pure survival. Bumpy was doing something different, which was using it, treating it as a resource rather than an obstacle, investing it in reading and chess and the specific cultivation of understanding that would eventually be useful again when the circumstances changed. He was not waiting for Alcatraz to end. He was working while Alcatraz lasted, on whatever work the environment permitted, in preparation for the work that the environment would eventually permit again. This quality, the capacity to use time rather than merely endure it, is the capacity that separates people who emerge from extended adversity intact from people who emerge diminished. It requires a relationship to the future that adversity normally destroys, because adversity is usually effective at making the future feel inaccessible or irrelevant. The thing that keeps the future feeling accessible when everything external is designed to make it feel otherwise, is an internal orientation that doesn't depend on external validation for its maintenance. Bumpy Johnson had this orientation, and 11 years of Alcatraz confirmed it, the way extreme conditions confirm things completely, at a cost, without ambiguity. He left Alcatraz in 1963 on a Monday morning in early spring. The paperwork was processed in the usual way. He was transported back to San Francisco by the usual boat. He made his way back to New York on his own recognizance, which was the standard arrangement. He arrived in Harlem on a Tuesday evening and went directly to the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue where Mame had maintained what he had left in the pest state that he had left it, because she had managed everything with the same quality of sustained commitment that he had maintained on the island. Harlem received him the way Harlem receives people who have done hard things and come back intact, with a specific kind of respect that is different from celebration, that acknowledges both the hardship and the survival of it without romanticizing either. He walked the blocks he had always walked, visited the people he had always visited, sat in the establishments where he had always sat. The neighborhood looked the same in the ways that mattered and different in the ways that 11 years of change always produces. And he filed the differences carefully alongside everything else he had filed in those years. What he did not do, by any account that survives, was speak extensively about what the 11 years had been like. He answered questions when they were asked, briefly and without embellishment. He did not tell stories about Alcatraz the way men sometimes tell stories about prisons, with the specific quality of narrative that turns experience into identity. For Bumpy, Alcatraz was simply where he had been, and where he had been was not the same as who he was, and who he was had not changed. This was, in the end, the full answer to the question that 11 years of institutional pressure had been designed to pose. The question was whether Bumpy Johnson was his circumstances, such that changing the circumstances changed the man. The answer was that he was not. He was himself, and himself, the reader, the chess player, the man who paid attention to the people around him and found ways to make their situation marginally better when he could, had been present throughout, doing whatever the environment permitted, waiting for the environment to change. The environment changed. He walked out. He was the same. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. The question that none of the wardens asked directly, and that the institutional records do not answer, is what Bumpy Johnson was thinking during those 11 years. Not what he read or played or improved, but what he was actually thinking in the specific private interior of a man who had built his career on understanding other people, and who suddenly had 11 uninterrupted years to apply that understanding to himself. This is speculation, because he did not write about it and did not speak about it in ways that were preserved. But the shape of what emerged from Alcatraz, the man who came back to Harlem in 1963, who spent the last 5 years of his life as a presence that people who knew him described as somehow more fully itself than the man who had left, suggests that the 11 years had produced something internal that the external record cannot directly observe. The people who had known him before and knew him after described this shift consistently, but struggled to name what it was. It was something closer to completion, the specific quality of a man who has arrived at a relationship with what he is that does not require external validation to maintain itself. This was what 11 years of Alcatraz had inadvertently produced, by providing the conditions under which that relationship could be reached. The institution had intended to destroy. It had instead allowed everything internal to consolidate in ways that external abundance had always deferred. He died in 1968, 5 years after Alcatraz. He died in a restaurant, at dinner, of a heart that had been working harder than it should have for longer than it should have. He was 62 years old. The 5 years between Alcatraz and his death were the years that the people who knew him best described as his fullest, not his most powerful, not his most visible, but his most fully expressed, in the sense of most completely what he actually was. The wardens are a footnote to this. The 11 years they presided over were not, in the accounting that matters, a story about what the wardens did or failed to do. They were a story about a man who had a specific relationship to himself and to the world, and who maintained that relationship through conditions designed to dissolve it, and who came out the other side with it, not just intact, but deepened. It is about what that man was made of, that nothing the system applied to him could unmake it. It is about the distinction between a man who is his circumstances and a man who is himself, and what that distinction looks like when it is tested in the most complete way the American government in 1952 knew how to test it. Bumpy Johnson was himself. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.